All right, today we started chapter 3, and we're climbing out of that American Revolution, and we kind of talked about what's going on in post-war American society amongst who has rights or who's considered an American, and what's the uh, limits that some people have when it comes to their rights. So we kind of talked about what society looks like. Today we're going to talk about politically, what do we do? We left last chapter with a temporary government known as the Articles of Confederation that just doesn't seem to be working. Although it had a good Land Act idea with the Northwest Ordinance, a good process for admitting states, we called that a positive, it wasn't going to be able to govern this nation who had just fought for much, much more during the American Revolution. So we're going to meet in Philadelphia today at the Constitutional Convention. We're going to figure out what to do with the Articles of Confederation, and we're going to go from there. Now, behind me, I have the three branches of government. We learned last chapter with the Enlightenment philosopher Baron de Montesquieu. This is kind of the goal. This is kind of what we want to get at today. But at the Constitutional Convention, we're going to find that it's very difficult to get those who are from different regions and parts of the country to come together and all in agreement on what this government is supposed to look like. We really see a divide specifically over should we or should we not move forward with the institution of slavery. And we have those who represent the Southern delegation who are going to be adamant in their defense to keep slavery part of who they are in their state and how they operate and economically what makes them a prosperous region in this new America we're getting ready to start. We're going to have a few others who voiced an opinion that it should end now. They're in a minority. And then we're going to have others who are there for other topics and issues to discuss. One of the biggest challenges is determining the representation of this body right here, which we will refer to as the legislative branch. Right now there's 13 individuals of representation, one for each colony. We call that a unicameral legislature. What is proposed is that we have an idea from Virginia that we split it and one side be based on population of each state. We have an idea out of New Jersey that each side be based on equal representation. Together, we basically model what we learned earlier was done in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and we create a two-house Congress or a two-house legislature. We do one based on what we'll call the House of Representatives, and we'll call this one the Senate. Now we put that together and we call that the Great Compromise. So on your sheet in your little box where it says Great Compromise, please write in there two houses. We would call that a bicameral legislature. Collectively, we call that the Great Compromise. Our next compromise was over population. The North wanted to count their population for representation purposes, and so did the South, but the South recognized real quickly they were at a disadvantage. They were at a disadvantage because were they or were they not going to be allowed to count their slaves toward the population? The big question was who counts toward the population? If the South is not allowed to count their slaves, then they're at a huge disadvantage when it comes to who gets to serve in this lawmaking part of America. And being at a disadvantage also means possibly the future extinction of slavery. If the Northern delegation can get the votes, they could end slavery. So there's this tension that is definitely building. Well, mathematically, they were able to come up with a scenario where if they're allowed to count 3 out of every 5 slaves, that would make it a little more balanced. They would have not quite complete equal representation, but it would be fair. There wouldn't be a majority held by the North, and that they could compromise on this. So for your 3/5 compromise, that's what this is called, please write representation in that small box. Now, The North only went along with this as if they could tax 3 out of every 5. Remember, the Northern delegation said, we pay taxes on our houses and our land, and that's our property. Therefore, if the South can count 3 out of every 5 slaves, they call slaves property, so they also have to pay taxes. So both sides kind of took jabs at each other in order to make it, in their eyes in that time period, a fair compromise. My last compromise is called the slave trade compromise. Looking at statistics and looking at the amount of slaves that came into Charleston, South Carolina through the trans-African slave trade, it was proposed that there would be a steady influx of more and more and more and more slaves, and that eventually, if the South is allowed to keep counting 3 out of every 5, they might have the majority when it comes to population. So we got to kind of figure out a relative estimation time frame of when or how long we can allow this slave trade to exist. And there our founding fathers came up with what is called the Slave Trade Compromise, in which they said for 20 years it will be allowed to operate and we will keep it open. But after 20 years, by 1808, the slave trade's going to end. So for the Slave Trade Compromise, please write 20 years. For 20 more years, it'll be in operation. Now together, here's our definition for constitutional compromises. They were a bundle of agreements. They were a bundle of agreements between northern and southern states, between northern and southern states, to create fair representation, to create fair representation in the legislative branch. In the legislative branch. Now, besides the topic of slavery, if we could move it to the side, as the founding fathers did, and we can now move into what is the future of the government behind me? What does it look like? Okay, we kind of just wrapped up the legislative branch, but what about the other 2 branches? What we're going to do is see 2 sides emerge. We're going to call one group the Federalist and the other group the Anti-Federalist. Here's your definition for the Federalist. The Federalists believed in a strong national government. They believed in a strong national government. Period. Now my Federalists are going to be led by a man by the name of Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton believes that this government behind me is very important and it should be superior over the states. Now that's kind of hard to imagine at this point because it is the states who are here at the Constitutional Convention that are giving life to this new national government. They're creating it. And it's hard for them to say, let's create something that's over us. Let's create something that has more power than we do. And for some, that seemed a little frightening. It reminded them of a tyrannical king they had just got away from. So they're going to kind of move out of this type of strong federal idea and kind of create their own little group as well. Well, when that begins to happen, Hamilton and his buddies decide to write some essays, these Federalist papers, trying to convince not only other delegates, but have them take these essays and put them in the newspaper and send them throughout the new American states to convince people that we need a strong central government. And this is how it's going to operate, and this is what it's going to do, and this is why it's important. Collectively, we call these the Federalist Papers. Here's your definition. The Federalist Papers were a group of essays. They were a group of essays written to convince Americans to ratify the U.S. Constitution. To ratify the U.S. Constitution. That means approve it. Say yes to it. Okay. Now, my I don't think so. I don't think we can go along with this strong national government. But we have some ideas too. How about we do this? How about we make sure there's a system of checks and balances put in place with this separation of powers? How about we make sure that each branch can check and balance each other? In other words, let's make sure it's limited government. And then maybe we can talk about ratifying the Constitution. But also, let's make sure that states forever will retain their rights, that this new national government behind me won't overpower the states. So let's make sure that states have sovereignty also. And most importantly, this would be the anti-federalist still, we need a national Bill of Rights added to the U.S. Constitution. This idea right here behind me must secure rights in all Americans. Hence, that's what Americans died for in the Revolution. So here you go, you're anti-federalist. Your anti-federalists believed in limited government, comma. They believed in limited government, comma. Separation of power, comma. Checks and balances, comma. States' rights, yep, comma. And a Bill of Rights, period. Anti-federalists believed in limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, states' rights, and a Bill of Rights. They said you add all that, and you make sure that's part of this new government behind me. We'll ratify the Constitution. And as we'll see later in the chapter, if we can get 9 states to say yes, the Constitution will become the law of the land. And then we decide how are these 3 branches going to function. That's it.